Canada is smack down in the biggest housing crisis of our lifetimes. And this crisis didn't just come out of the blue. It's been 25 years in the making. But if you listen to all the stuff said by the politicians, you might actually think they want to fix the crisis. But guess what? They don't give a shit. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Canada is known for some of the most beautiful landscapes in the entire world. Did you know that Canada has the second largest landmass? Only Russia is bigger. So Canada's big, real bloody big. But you know what else is big? My subscriber numbers. Well, not now, but they could be with your help. So please consider subscribing to my channel and give this video a like if you enjoy what I present. I'll provide you with independent analysis and commentary. Now today's all about Canada, and boy oh boy has Canada screwed up their housing market. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, Canadian housing was very affordable, with the average price between $100,000 and $200,000. But from 2000 onwards, Canadian house prices started a very steep climb. And this sharp increase in house prices continued all the way up to COVID, when crazy COVID policies put a rocket under house prices and sent them through the roof. What's even more worrying than just the house prices themselves is how far they've risen in comparison to income. So if we look at house prices versus disposable income, which is the average income after tax and any other deductions are taken out, we can see that prior to 2000, they actually rose in similar increments, meaning that house prices were rising around about the same levels as disposable income. But this all changed in the early 2000s, and look how far the gap's becoming between house prices here in red and disposable incomes all the way down here. What this means in real terms is that buying a house back here was very affordable, and for each new generation it was just as affordable. But as the gap widened, every year it became harder and harder for someone to buy their own home, to where we are now, and this graph's from mid 2021. The gap has become astronomical, and trying to buy a home in Canada is now almost impossible for some people. So that's why I say that this housing crisis is actually around 25 years in the making, because this here has all resulted in the current housing crisis we see today. Now just compare that with the US. Income in the US was very strong compared to house prices, and then we saw house prices rise slightly above disposable income, but then fell away sharply during the global financial crisis, and house prices are now only recently rising back up to where disposable incomes had risen. So the contrast between housing affordability in Canada compared to the US is like night and day. Well, if house prices rise faster than incomes year after year and hardly ever go down, like this tiny blip during the GFC, then it just feeds on itself that house prices only rise, which creates more and more demand. And if you're working and receiving an income that's going up like this, but you see house prices go up like this, you'll basically do anything to get as many properties as you can, because those properties are rising faster than your actual income is. And when this happens over 25 years, it creates ridiculous speculative demand, because basically everyone's competing for property. You've got investors desperate to try and get more property to realize more gains, but then you've got nearly every renter trying to get into the housing market so they too can get some gains, but also get out of the rental market, especially now since it's turned into a crisis. So just like zombies seem to have an insatiable desire for brains, Canadians have an insatiable desire for property. And can you blame them when you see how properties performed? Man, if you can make more money just owning a property rather than slaving at your job, wouldn't you do anything to get in the market? So when people talk about the current housing crisis, for me, the real crisis has formed over many years because we've allowed more and more crazy speculation enter the housing market, so that property is now considered a way to gain wealth rather than a safe place for citizens to live. And when the government shows that they'll do anything they have to prop up the housing market, then people realize that investing in property is the closest thing to a sure bet. But the results of allowing this rampant speculation can be extremely devastating. It creates a massive wealth divide between the property haves and the property have-nots. And for young people who won't inherit a large property portfolio, they're basically starting from a massive disadvantage. Because back here, even with a low income job, you could have easily afforded to buy a house and pay it off quite quickly, whereas people trying to buy now have to get a ginormous mortgage and will struggle to pay it off over many, many years. So in addition to the inbuilt speculative demand, why on earth have Canadian house prices gotten so expensive? Well, one major reason is interest rates. You see, since the early 2000s, interest rates in Canada have generally been ultra cheap. In the early 2000s, they went from 6% all the way down to 2%, came up a bit in the lead up to the GFC, but after 2008, look what's happened. Dropped to near zero, and then didn't trade until 2% until COVID hit, and then went back to zero. So since around 2009, interest rates have been near zero. And you know what ultra cheap interest rates do? They encourage people to get larger and larger mortgages because it's easier to service. And if people can borrow more, they can pay more for houses, which facilitates ridiculous house price growth. So keeping rates ultra cheap or running an ultra loose monetary policy is a major factor in Canada's house price boom or house price bubble, as I like to think of it. So successive governments in Canada have seen houses grow way faster than income, and they encourage this to continue with ultra cheap interest rates. There were so many years that Canada could have put in policies to try to reduce this overall speculative demand, and the Bank of Canada could have kept interest rates higher to try to discourage more and more leverage into the property market. So that's the first reason why Canada doesn't give a crap about housing affordability, because they watched it getting worse and worse without taking any reasonable action. Now there's heaps of talk in Canadian politics around housing affordability and trying to improve it.
There's a recognition that as families look to get into the housing market right now, it's getting more and more difficult, and even as families save up and work hard, every passing year seems to get housing further and further away from them.
And whenever I hear the government talk about it, they always seem to blame supply. It's supply and demand, guys. That's why house prices are some of the most expensive in the entire world. We don't have enough supply. Trouble is, for 25 years, house prices have gone ridiculous. Was every one of those years to do with supply? Are there not whole entire areas whose sole focus or sole job is to try to facilitate enough supply for the projected population? You know how sometimes people say things but they don't actually mean them? Like, we have to improve housing affordability. We gotta fix this housing crisis. There's a generalization that young guys would say anything to try and have their way with a girl.
I only have eyes for you.
This is an old stereotype, remember? So if we take that generalization, but substitute the guy for the Canadian government, we've got someone who's trying to tell us all the right things, make us feel like they genuinely want to fix the problem, but all the while they're just trying to screw us over. So why do I say this? Well, it's right here. For all their rhetoric about not enough supply, Canada's running the highest immigration levels on record, sending population growth through the roof, with the Canadian population increasing by 1.2 million in just the last 12 months. So you're saying there's not enough supply, but you're the ones creating the problem by opening the immigration floodgates. How can any country create enough supply for 1.2 million additional people per year? Now, I'm not saying immigration's bad. With an aging population, I understand why countries want to bring in working age immigrants. But why go nuts with it when we're smack bang in the middle of a housing crisis? When many locals can't afford to buy a home, are struggling to afford their rent, and some being kicked out onto the streets. The easiest way to fix the supply issue is to moderate these immigration levels. You could halve these levels and improve things considerably. When you have a real issue, it takes real action. Struggling Canadians have heard enough talk. They want to see real action that's going to improve housing affordability, because the entire future of Canadian society and way of life is at stake. I'm Biko Konstantinos.